3, 2, 1, ao vivo.
Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Marcelo Furtado. I'm a principal at Nature Finance, and I would like to welcome you all for being with us today. This is a great pleasure for us to be here hosting this international webinar. A technical element for you, the webinar will be held in English, but there is a translation button on the bottom of your screen. If you rather have your feed in Portuguese, there is a direct translation for our Portuguese speakers. This is the second webinar that we are doing on the theme. The first one was held in late September, and we directed to the Brazil audience and to the Brazilian elections. Today, we're doing this webinar focusing on the international aspects of our work. But let me just take 1 minute to introduce the Nature Finance, because a lot of people may know us as Finance for Biodiversity, and you're probably wondering why Nature Finance. And Nature Finance is our new organization. It's a Geneva-based not-for-profit dedicated to aligning global finance with equitable, nature-positive outcomes, and thereby accelerating climate goals, just transition, and sustainable development. Our work spans off initiatives that are building on using biodiversity data to better manage nature-related risks. We also are looking at developing purposeful nature markets, advancing financial innovation, including in sovereign debt markets, stretching nature-related liabilities, and most importantly, citizen action on nature. We have today with us a fantastic team that worked heavily this year in order to bring incredible content for you. And at the same time that we see the world in this perfect storm with food prices rising, energy prices rising, supply chain disruptions, inflation, growing poverty, inequality, and an increasingly public debt going on one hand, and on the other hand, we see this growing climate risks with droughts, floods, biodiversity loss. A lot of people feel extremely insecure. We see the issue of food and energy as national security issues arising to the geopolitical discussions. The war in Ukraine is rupturing the global food markets, challenging the multilateral system with a very negative impact on equitable global political agenda, both regarding climate and nature. And this all gives a huge challenge for us, particularly because we see the deeper impact through hunger and poverty, particularly in developing countries, with this exponential increase of food, agricultural input prices, and so on. So all that begs the question of how should the world look into its future? And what if, due to all this situation and delays on eliminating fossil fuels and stopping deforestation, we miss the 1.5 degree target and indeed operate on a 2 to 3 degrees world? How are we going to transform our economy in alignment with climate and nature challenges? How are we going to create jobs, income, and social inclusion while valuing our environmental assets? And the discussion today centers a lot on looking at this from a finance and food nexus. And we, for that, invited Jason Ives from Vivid Economics to demonstrate to us a global model that we commissioned from his team to look into what would the world look like when we put all these challenges ahead, but yet aim to reach a net zero and no biodiversity loss planet by 2050, followed by Sarah, that will cover the issue of consumers and how consumers relate to this. And then we'll go to Alex Tobin and Isabel Rodrigo from Imaflora that will talk about when we choose a specific jurisdiction. So we leave the global general map and we go for a real economy of a food producing country and a nature-rich country, how would that respond? As an example of what could happen in different, in this case, tropical agricultural countries, but also in different jurisdictions all over the planet. So with that, let me welcome Jason Eyes and have you share, Jason, with us the results from your modeling, which in a challenging environment which we're operating, we're actually hoping that you can bring us good news. Please.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Marcelo. I'm Jason Ice, Executive Director at Vivid Economics, and I've been working as part of the Nature Finance Initiative on this and various topics over the last 3 years. As Marcelo said, I'm going to present work that we've done under kind of our partnership or our research collaboration with Nature Finance around how financial risk repricing might affect outcomes and how that might look under different kind of policy environments. So just to reiterate just a little bit, the aim of this project in particular was to gain a bit of insight and to fill a research gap around how we think the food and financial systems might interact in future scenarios, contrasting a world in which global food systems, financial systems, and food systems react purely on a risk basis to one in which we look at scenarios with a more facilitating role by policymakers, and I'll get into that. And by using these two contrasting scenarios, the aim was to see how different some of our key outcomes might be, and hence understand what the value of pursuing a more orderly and policy facilitated scenario might be. And we've looked both at the core nature outcomes themselves, climate and nature, and then also at the other outcomes in which the sector is so critical in the creation of income and jobs, and of course the provision of affordable nutrition. Now, this is a relatively sophisticated kind of counterfactual analysis, and before I jump into the details of the work, I wanted to first sketch out sort of what the hypotheses are, like how we were looking at the ways in which this might unfold at the nexus of finance and food, and how one might and why it's worthwhile to look at kind of two potentially important pathways. And the main I think element that the work wants to get across is that a purely risk-based financial sector reaction to kind of nature and climate goals could kind of abruptly correct or abruptly shift the food system in ways that are more disruptive and with poorer outcomes than one in which you've got a smartly enabled policy. And that involves a belief that this transition, and I think a belief that markets are increasingly starting to come to, that a shift is inevitable, and the pressures on nature, the pressures across boundaries in terms of expectations on trade and the realization of the bigger impacts is going to mean that there will be a shift, and that markets are understanding and starting to price in that risk. And markets have always had a key role in thinking about what might happen as risks unfold, and to push those into the way they price risk in the real sectors. And as an uncertain but strong sense of these risks is unfolding, that could lead to the financial sector actually pushing a very risk-driven and abrupt response to some of these risks, rather than an orderly one, and that the close ties between the financial systems, those that are financing food, would essentially mean that kind of abrupt transition and that risk-driven response by the financial sector could leave the food sector and the financial sector itself exposed. And so, kind of a hypothesis, and then what we wanted to test with the model is that kind of more appropriate and timely mitigation policies could play an important role in facilitating a much better outcome from the transition, rather than one in which financial sector anticipation and attempt to risk price, uncertain and potentially more abrupt policies would lead. And so to get at the question of, how does this differ between the two scenarios, and why there might be, and what that might mean for these key outcomes that we want to achieve, we've done two broad scenarios. One where we've modeled how a financial risk repricing in the sector would in itself drive transitions in the food system, what that would mean for some of our key outcomes, versus a world in which there are supportive policies to a transition, not only risk-based, but supportive of better pricing and valuation of nature and carbon, and better outcomes for communities, how that would look in terms of mitigating some of those, that shift in the food system, and how it would affect different outcomes. At the highest level, the results show that a policy facilitated transition improves economic and social outcomes in the food sector compared to the financial risk-driven scenario. And it also leads actually to better environmental outcomes. So, even if you had a very strong sort of risk reaction in the financial sector in which environmental outcome risks were priced in, that would not do as good a job as an orderly scenario and actually achieving even the environmental outcomes, let alone the economic and social. And as you might expect, in the absence of that policy, these external events can trigger quite an abrupt correction from the kind of accumulated risks over time, and that has real impacts. And I'll talk about some of the better outcomes in a second. So the four outcomes we looked at, as I mentioned, were climate, nature, income and jobs, and affordable nutrition. Contrasting between the two scenarios, in a risk-driven scenario, you will see in a second, there are improvements as financial sector divests and reallocates capital away from the environmentally intensive sectors. You see that resulting in some improvements in our environmental outcomes. But the abruptness of the transition affects economic outcomes with quite a lot of negative effects on those sectors that were associated with deforestation, and a relatively more significant increase in short-term food prices and the possibility of affordable nutrition. While in contrast, a policy facilitated scenario not only results in risks in a risk response that helps end deforestation activities, but also supports alternative economic activities, which by supporting those activities leads to better environmental outcomes, because you're now more positively incentivizing not just an end to negative, but also a positive shift. And those have spillover effects to creating new income and job opportunities, and to also help to mitigate some of the food price increases that might result from this. So let me quickly show you those results in charts. These are global numbers. So as I was saying, both scenarios would reduce emissions. So even if it's purely risk driven, you would see a reduction in carbon emissions, owing to the fact that risk repricing would make it much harder for deforestation activities to continue. But in a policy facilitated environment, you see kind of a couple of additional positive impacts, which are quite significant. One is that you start to see incentives for restorative activities. So, a risk-based repricing, under kind of disorderly policy, won't create in itself the incentives for a regenerative system, and so you see that in more carbon sequestration opportunities for those countries that have that opportunity, which would include countries like Brazil, and you also see it in terms of more value put on improving nature outcomes and biodiversity, with a much more significant reversal and improvement in biodiversity. And that's all about creating value for nature and restorative activities, which of course we need orderly policy to do. In addition, as we can see, a kind of a policy facilitated scenario tends to lead to a better economic growth in the sector more broadly. And so you can see here, while a risk-driven version, doesn't result in a huge collapse of the sector, it does put pressure on the opportunities for growth in the agricultural and land use sector. It tends to limit opportunities more, which means the overall gross value add created by the sector stagnates and starts to decrease potentially, and that the jobs associated with it would similarly be impacted. While a policy facilitated scenario, while helping limit environmental damage, redirects activity towards things that can now create value from sequestration, and that leads to continued and steady growth actually in the overall gross value out of the sector, and a much better job opportunities environment for those involved. So that's essentially the crux of the analysis. And maybe just one last word before I hand it back to you, Marcelo. I think it's important to recognize some of the core differences in a policy facilitated scenario. And I've emphasized quite a lot that it's about creating obviously opportunities for value creation in terms of alternative activities. It's also helping facilitate the technological innovation and the creation of a facilitative environment. So it's not just the agricultural in essence producers, but the entire chain of the agricultural sector and the supporting inputs and technologies. And it's also about helping ensure that the communities and the workers and the skills that are in these environments are adapted to and able to move into new job opportunities. And without that, a purely financial risk-driven scenario, risks creating a sector that's having much more trouble transitioning with much poorer outcomes for people and for food. So with that, I will stop and hand back over to you, Marcelo.
Thank you so much, Jason. For the viewers that are intrigued by the word AFALU, just to remind that this means agriculture, forest, and land use, which means that the results Jason just shared with us, super interesting from a global point of view, indicates a whole decade ahead in the policy-driven model in terms of eliminating biodiversity loss. And on the net emissions for the agricultural, forest, and land use sector, we're talking about reaching net zero 15 years earlier. So these are super important results. Of course, these are modeling results, but they're very positive. And I also want to underscore that while food prices unfortunately continue to rise in the modeling that Jason presented, by 2035, it starts going down, which indicates that good policy framing together with investments can also have a huge impact on food prices and therefore access to food. And this is a very important element. Before we go to the application of this to the Brazil scenario, we have this major question about the role of consumers. So we have nature, we have finance, we have the food system that needs to change, we have pricing indicators, we have pressure of deforestation, but isn't consumer a key player on this? And with that question in mind, we invited Every Action Count, and we also invited Environmental Action to help us gather some data and also model that reality. And Sarah Behard, a director of Environmental Action, is here. So Sarah, please, would you like to share with us your findings?
Thanks so much, Marcelo. With pleasure. So it's my honor today to represent the project team that worked on this important piece of work for Nature Finance, which was a collaboration between EA, Environmental Action, the Green Digital Finance Alliance, the Every Action Counts Coalition, and Unicamp on a new angle on how to transition towards more sustainable food system. So The angle that we took on making this transition actionable was by offering e-commerce providers some insights on how to effectively support their customers in the transition towards healthier and also more sustainable food. And we also wanted to show policymakers that a transition towards more sustainable food system can be facilitated and what role they play in this. So we took Brazil as an example for this work, but the process could basically be applied to any jurisdiction by following the process that we developed. So we will follow that now together, so we can explain to you how that can be facilitated. So first, Unicamp behavioral science experts overtook a series of survey and research to understand the local food consumption behavior. So it was about understanding what was consumed and also why. So basically based on which beliefs and values. And in parallel, we modeled the environmental impact of the food consumption locally today. That was what we call our baseline.
Sarah, could I just interrupt you? Just want to make sure that people are seeing your presentation, because I'm not sure they are seeing it.
Okay, I apologize for that. Let me just do that again. Actually, I actually don't see the place where I can share anymore. Here we go. Okay, it seems it has disappeared for a little bit. I'm sorry about that. So let me just go back so that real quick. So the team
now we can see it.
Yes, sorry about that. Thank you, Marcelo, for noticing this. So this is the process that we followed. And so, as I was saying, we had first a behavior or consumption behavior study. Then we evaluated the impact of food consumption today. And then that's what actually allowed us to compare the impact to basically what we call the EAT diet. So the EAT diet was developed by the EAT Landslet Commission. And so why did we choose that? It's basically because this EAT diet is a diet that is compatible with both the planetary boundaries, so basically nature health, and with human health. And so this comparison then allowed us to identify the possible levers to reduce the impact of food consumption, and then to also measure their potential. So without surprise, the most important lever was to basically move towards a plant-rich diet or an alternative protein diet. And that was also the largest difference that we saw between the current average of local diet and the EAT diet. So based on the behavioral science study about local food consumption behavior, Unicamp experts then designed a series of nudges that we tested in an online experiment. And there were a lot of learnings from that, but there are three that we want to share with you. And they all are very linked with the importance of labeling as really a key and central piece that needs to be used wisely. So the first learning was that the vegan or vegetarian wording and labeling actually negatively influenced the choice of plant-based dairy and meat. And the reason that was given for that was mostly the preconceived idea that it would not taste as good as the product that it was replacing. On the other hand, the absence of vegetarian or vegan framing in some choices increased the likelihood of vegan or vegetarian recipes or products to be chosen. So if we were not telling them it was vegetarian or vegan, they were actually more likely to choose it. And then the third point is that the nudging effects, they actually differ for different types of food ingredients and labeling. So it's really important to also work on this adaptation to the different types of food. Following that, we were able to model the effect of the nudges if those nudges were applied at scale. And we did that actually on the e-commerce platform as an example. So it was applied on only the e-commerce platform's users, on the proportion of the population that actually care about the environment. And out of this niche population, when they were presented with alternatives to animal proteins and also to organic options, which was also something that we modeled, a portion of them actually kept those alternatives because they trusted that the proposed alternative responded to their values. So with this in mind, we modeled the effect of this nudge if it was applied at scale on this niche. And we see that the green curve, that it's actually already offering some encouraging perspective. It shows a potential of reduction of 155 megatons of CO2 emissions by 2050 compared to what we call the baseline scenario, or the business as usual, if you want. So that's almost 1/3, or actually even more than 1/3 of what we would need to reach actually this planetary boundary safe diet. And then we translated our learnings into recommendations for e-commerce platforms on how to basically implement that. So the first one was implementing choices pre-selection for those eco-friendly consumers. So showing them things that we believe they would actually support. The second was applying an educational process for food labeling. This is key that consumers understand the labels. A third one was combining multiple nudges together to increase their effectiveness. Another one was to ensure the visibility of the eco-friendly products compared to the non-eco-friendly products. So making it as visible as other products, basically. And a blueprint is available for e-commerce retailers in the report. So for retailers to be able to further adopt them, and we are explaining this into much more detail. Then building on those conclusions also from the vivid economics that showed that the policy facilitated transition improves social and economic outcomes in the agricultural and food system, we translated the e-commerce recommendations into policy recommendations. So those are the following. The first is actually developing this comprehensive labeling policy to account for the avoided emissions and the other impacts of food products. Another one is to design an educational program on food consumption that then can be implemented where the consumers make their food choices, so e-commerce platforms or retailers, etc. And the third one is to really ensure that all of the societal actors and stakeholders of the food system are involved into both of those steps, because that would allow to really push the effectiveness, ensure the acceptability, and that they feel part of this transition. So in conclusion, our work confirmed the importance of the consumer role in the food system transition, because if they are empowered by retailers, with the support from policymakers, we clearly see that a transformation of the food system to operate within planetary boundaries is possible. And so we see that, so there are a few key takeaways. The first is, so consumers, they play a critical role in fostering the necessary food system transitions, and they need to be placed at the center of the food system transformation. But for this to happen, we need the support from from public policy, so that the proven successful interventions can be implemented at scale. And to reach the impact of the equivalent of this EAT diet, or the planetary boundary safe diet, it is necessary to test further nudging strategies that will reach a larger proportion of the population. So the world is moving fast towards digitalization, and we really hold an opportunity to implement nudges, as proven by this study, to move the food system towards operating within planetary boundaries, and the opportunity to scale this further than the e-commerce platforms also remains large. And that would really allow to basically fill up this remaining 2/3 of impact reduction that we need to address, and that we actually can address collectively with a consumer-centric approach that is supported by policy, by public policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And for our followers, I think it's important to flag that there is a wealth of information available on our website on Nature Finance with a full report that goes very much deep into the nudging of Brazilian consumers. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, we did this global view. But then we said, okay, but how does that react? How does that relate to an actual jurisdiction? And the reason why we chose Brazil is first because of being the fourth largest food producing country in the world. It was a very critical player. Being the host of the largest tropical forest of the planet, it has this balance of nature and economics. But even more because we have an upcoming election, and we felt that it would be very important to inform the candidates, be it at the presidential level, governor level, or Congress level, that choices that we make in public policy align to good financial and investment strategies play a critical role. And to go deeper on these two aspects, we invited Alex Coverley, from a senior researcher at Imperial College, and Isabel Drigo from Imaflora to elaborate, and I'll give you the floor now to tell us, Alex, when you did the modeling applied to a Brazil jurisdiction, as an example of something we could see in different parts of the planet. What kind of results we got. And Isabel, if you could tell us a little bit about what are the cluster of policies, because we know that each country will have their specificities, but maybe, as I understand, we were able to, through this study, select a cluster of policymaking strategies that will probably work in other jurisdictions as well. So please, Alex.
Thank you, Marcelo. Hopefully you can see and hear me okay. So as Marcelo said, the objective here was to take the global study and the findings there and apply the same types of scenarios that were used there, but then do a deeper dive into Brazil, and also using a bit more granularity in how we applied certain policies and how we examined some of the results. So as Jason showed in the global case, but also in the Brazil case, emissions reduce, biodiversity increases, jobs and economic activity actually improve in a policy mediated transition rather than a simple just letting the financial sector price risk on its own without the coordinating effect of sound policy design. So we wanted to understand what was behind these reductions in emissions, this increase in biodiversity indicators, and so on. And to do that, let me make sure that this moves. Yeah. So as I was saying, we used similar scenarios to the global study. There was a few tweaks here and there, but it was basically the same idea. Policy-driven versus a finance-led scenario. Focus on Brazil as a case study, and also this was also designed in a way that this framework could also be adapted for other regions, so that this could also inform policymaking elsewhere. One of the important things in designing this for a specific country is the context of that country. So in taking this framework elsewhere, one of the things that where the starting point of the process would be to understand the context of that specific region or country. And as Marcelo already mentioned, Brazil is the fourth largest food exporter, is home to the Amazon, and it is expected to continue playing an important part in the global food systems, and especially so in its transition. And although Brazil's agri-food sector is already taking steps to reduce its environmental footprint, it is not shielded from transition risk in the form of foregone revenues. That means it has exposure to a global transition, even though it is already taking steps to reduce its footprint. It is exposed to considerable physical and transition risks on both ends. And what this means is exposed to the impacts of climate change itself and of nature loss and biodiversity loss itself. Those are the physical risks. But it's also exposed to the transition risks, which manifest in terms of higher cost of capital, reduced demand for products that are, for example, linked to deforestation, and so on. So anything that is the effect of a transition to a sustainable food system. So these are both climate and nature related. And for the physical effects on Brazilian agriculture, it's really important to understand that it is mostly rain-fed agriculture. So Brazil enjoys really beneficial climate for agriculture to happen without the need for irrigation. But that also makes it very exposed to any climate change-driven changes in precipitation patterns. And then, so this is the broad context, and then we want to understand, okay, so then what are the elements of a transition? How is the agricultural sector itself seeing itself in this global context? And one of the things that is already well established, everyone knows about this in Brazil, is that improving the productivity of the livestock system in particular carries many benefits for society, and also including for the stakeholders, the farmers themselves who are involved in the current system. So it increases, by improving the productivity, it reduces the land demand, it creates opportunities for other uses of that land, including reforestation, rewilding, for example, or also other types of crops being planted. Maybe bioenergy could be part of that as well. And because the livestock sector is mostly beef, basically, production in Brazil, and it has a lot of room to improve. It is well below its potential productivity potential. So with investments, it could improve its performance considerably. Policy approaches that are then aligned with this rise of nature and carbon credit markets can actually provide some of the revenue, some of the funding that would go into these necessary investments to then improve this underperforming livestock sector in Brazil, at least the underperforming part of the livestock sector, which is really a large share of it. But one of the things that would be required is that the relevant stakeholders, farmers, policymakers, decision makers, they need to recognize that the sector is under threat from several of these compounding and cascading risk drivers that I was just mentioning, nature and climate. So the individuals, the firms, and the whole industries, they must relinquish, they need to stop assuming that the sector can continue to do business as it has done in the past. So this assumption that the future will look like it did in the past needs to be broken. We need to understand that there is no business as usual. Either there will be a transition or there will be a lot of impacts. And once that realization is crystallized, then we can start moving into a constructive debate about, okay, then what can we do about this? What would be the best way to do that? So some of the social environmental risks that we're talking about, so climate, nature, but also finance. So
alguns dos riscos que estávamos falando o clima.
But there's also social risk. There's the issue of employment, food security, equity, and inclusion. So to create a more inclusive food system, more inclusive agricultural system that provides jobs and good nutrition for as many people as possible. There is also this idea of a diet shift, as Sarah was just talking about from the consumer side. And although this is met with some resistance in the Brazilian agricultural sector, that this wouldn't happen in Brazil, that countries like China, for example, would not, as their incomes will rise, they will not stop consuming meat products. But there are lots of factors that actually may lead to a reduction in animal protein demand, not just diet shifts. But even with diet shifts, it is not a safe assumption to think that demand in Brazil and China alone can maintain the current production levels in the country. So if the whole world goes to an Eat Lancet diet, or even half of the Eat Lancet diet, if there's any shifts in demand, and Brazil and China maintain their current trajectories, that doesn't mean that that demand will be fulfilled with Brazilian produced beef and meat products. So because there will be an excess demand since supply, an excess supply since demand is going down, so prices would readjust, and there will be different market shares for different players. And also, there's an important component of alternative proteins, plant-based proteins, microbial fermentation types of proteins. And as countries begin to seek food security, given the current context of the commodities market in the world, for example, China has announced that it intends to invest into alternative protein value chains. So there is a considerable risk that even just from an economics point of view, that the Brazilian livestock sector faces. And this is something that is a different study that I'm leading for the Food System Economics Commission on a Brazil case study on the livestock sector, that we're looking more at trade and the position of the country in global markets. And if the whole world goes to an Eat Lancet diet, except Brazil and China, that what would happen, and this is the green line here, is that Brazil would become a net importer of beef instead of a net exporter. And this is just because the price differences, because of supply demand rebalancing, would shift the competitiveness from the less competitive portion of Brazilian producers to other producers around the world. So it'd be cheaper to import meat than to produce it locally. So there is a real risk there that this sector faces that is non-negligible. And to counteract that, so now we go back to the same scenarios that we were looking at with with Jason's presentation. And the blue line here is the policy driven, and the red line is the finance driven. And we can see that on the investments are higher because the conditions, the enabling conditions for investment are put in place through policy. So there's a clear path. There's a de-risking element that can go into this. So the investment costs go down, so there's more investments that are made, and this increases land use intensity for both crops and pastures, but it also, which in turn increase the productivity of both beef, and in this case, I'm showing the example of soy, which is one of the major export commodities in Brazil. So this clear policy signal, what it does is improve the enabling conditions, improves the investability of the sector. So it enables this transition to be done at a more efficient manner. And these improvements in productivity reduce the planted area, so with less land demand, even though the demand for the products isn't changed. Finally, on the alternative proteins front, this is a global market share. That was the figure on the right that we're seeing. If the whole world goes to 50%, which is quite an extreme scenario, but by 2050, that 50% of animal protein will come from alternative sources, so plant-based, microbial-based, and so on. And Brazil has a potential to be a really important global supplier of not just the inputs like sugars and raw agricultural materials that will go into assembling these proteins through a food industry application. So Brazil not only has potential to be an important supplier of these raw materials, but also through investment in the whole value chain to keep some of this added value in the country and export the final product rather than the raw inputs. Africa also has a similar potential, and given that it has much more area that this could be, without any targeted policies from any of the countries, just following trends and costs, Africa gains most of the market share just because it would benefit from low-cost production. But targeted policies to support the emergence of a Brazilian value chain for these alternative proteins can really improve competitiveness. And now is the time to do that, to gain competitive advantage. Now will be the time to make these investments, to attract the talent that would be driving this new sector. It is really about industrial policy, not just agricultural policy, but a whole industrial policy that would need to be put in place to start reaping the benefits in a few years to come. And we already see that there are some large Brazilian food processing companies that are making investments in that direction, but the public sector is lagging in its vision of this, and this could be one important aspect of policy that could help Brazil maintain its leadership position in the global agricultural commodities market. And with that, I'll pass it back to Marcelo, and I think what the set of policy recommendations that we made for Brazil are going to be described in less detail for Brazil, but more in general terms by Isabel next. And thank you very much for this.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. And I think what is fascinating from this study is the indication that if you are a large food producing country, and if you are very much nature-based, still, when you look into opportunities into the future, we're looking at nature gains, we're looking at climate resilience, we're looking at productivity improvement, we're looking at economic benefits, which will translate, therefore, into jobs, incomes, and access to nutrition. The big question we had, right, Isabel, was, okay, but what policies can be selected to deliver that? And you covered the policies in very much detail at our Brazil-specific webinar. And I understand that today what you want to do is bridge from the Brazil case to a more international reality. So let me then leave you now to make your presentation. I think it just came out of the screen. It was there. Oh, no, it's back. Okay. Excellent.
Yes. So thanks, Marcelo, and thanks all the colleagues and the audience that are here and seeing us. So let's go. So as Marcelo already said, I will talk a little bit more about this cluster of strategic areas for policymaking in this challenge transition of agri-food systems. And first of all, I have to say that this presentation is highly based in the great synthesis that my dear colleague Karen Suassuna have provided, because Karen is really a specialist in this policy building, and she actually worked in some of the design of some of the policies we will highlight in this report. So that said, I will start my presentation presenting these 6 strategic areas for policy recommendation that we can see highlighted in this report, Finance, Nature, and Food Systems. Look into the Brazilian case, but I will try to show to you the main features, the main characteristics that can inform other countries. So it's less about to go deep in the details of the Brazilian policies or Brazilian instruments, but more in the general aspects and the general lessons that we can share to other countries and governments and also civil society. So you can see this in the screen, these 6 strategy areas. I will talk a little bit more about the first one, the sustainable intensification and better efficiency. Where is this issue addressed in the Brazilian policy set of policies? Also, smart agriculture, the development of value chain, alternative protein. My colleague Alexandre already talked a little bit about that, so I will not talk much about. But the command and control, the social part, so the care for family farmers and people in vulnerable situation, and a little bit about encouraging sustainable consumption. Then I will try to to show you this typology, and as I have already said, the main characteristics of the set of the Brazilian policies. So if you can separate in three main categories, we can see that you have a kind of framing, how to frame the transition to a low carbon agriculture. It starts with the strategy one, that's the sustainable intensification, also with the smart agriculture and nature-based solution. And in Brazil, there is a policy instrument, if you can name like this, that is the low carbon agriculture plan. So it's a plan, but the content of this plan is a series of agricultural practices that receive and have to receive different finance strategies from federal government, but also from the subnational governments. It's really a plan to say the ways you can improve, you can promote low carbon agriculture. For instance, we have in this plan the recovery of degraded pasture-land, the no-till systems, the integration of cattle, agriculture, and forest production, and all practices we can classify as sustainable intensification and smart agriculture. It's important to say that this plan was the first of this kind. It was launched in 2010, prior to COP of Copenhagen, and encompasses, as you can see, the major suggestions we have to put this agenda forward, to put the agenda of low carbon agriculture forward. So other countries can inspire in this frame to design their policies. So another set of, or another category of policies, it's very important to countries as Brazil, but also Africa and other Asian countries that have a lot of forests yet, but that are many threatened by crimes and by deforestation, is the set of command and control policies. There we have in Brazil a package for nature protection and to reduce the illegality, the illegal deforestation. It encompasses monitoring of deforestation, a national system to monitor deforestation, alert systems, and also combining law enforcement involving the federal prosecutors in Brazil, for instance, with administrative measures, for instance, the embargoes of properties that have deforestation problems. They cannot sell or be in the trade, even it is difficult and challenging to apply. The overall instruments, they say that. And also even financial constraints. We had measures regarding financial constraints, prevent to access to loans in the public banks. Also, some private banks adopted the same measures. So this set of command and control policies is very interesting, and all this needs a governance system to really function and to really can be enforced, both of them. The frame to a low carbon agriculture, the plans, and the policies to command and control illegal deforestation. And the last set of or type of policies are the social policies that are needed to put forward a fair transition to a low carbon system or to a low carbon agriculture. For example, we have the Brazilian Program for Acquisition of Food, with some strategies designed like really donate food and attending the public school system. The program for financing smallholder agriculture, because there is a need to look at the family farming and the needs of family farming. In Brazil, we have a huge territory. We have a different profiles of farms. Not all kind of farmers are able to access or are able to have the information and the knowledge and the help to implement the practices. So this program, for instance, have to have more technical assistance actions and measures. And also to be possible to give access to equitable funding for sustainable agriculture. All we have in this set of policies in Brazil regarding these three main set of policies. I'm okay with my time. You can warn me if not. But as I said, so in the last one, I was forgotten. This about sustainable consumption. This report highlights the need to advance food policies by designing social environmental labels. We have some social environmental labels in the market or being used by different companies in Brazil and around the world. But we need to improve these label systems and the targets to facilitate the understanding of social environment impact information. By developing a label on the front panel of packaged foods with using simple icons to emphasize the different aspects, because we have also so many labels in the market. So, and inform what is the right or special attributes of each product is challenging. So we need to, it's very good to use this strategy. Brazil is using this a lot to have national standards for organic food, for, I forgot the name in English, for these local origin attributes, but it's hard to inform very clear what are the important attributes. And when we talk about social and environment attributes, not only the quality of the product is more challenging. So we have all these sets in Brazil, but again, for any country, we need a governance system to organize these different instruments, policy instruments, and really to put in place or to implement all these actions that are foreseen in these plans. In Brazil, we had some experiences combining civil society efforts with government, federal government, also subnational governments. We have already this in place, but for any country, it's really, really very important to have governance and multi-stakeholder dialogue and improve and monitor all the policy instruments to be sure that they will continue in place and can be improved because the dynamic is very, very fast. I think that's it. Marcelo, you can talk a little bit more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And we'll be able to go back to you with some of the questions that are coming up. Let me then just do a very quick snapshot of where we are, because I hope that that will encourage folks for framing their questions. We started by me giving you an outline of where we are in the world, which was not a very happy one, We spoke about food insecurity. We spoke about a multilateral crisis. We spoke about a financial crisis, inflation, access, trade, all these elements. And then on top of that, the climate crisis, the nature loss crisis, climatic events, weather events happening and augmenting the impacts and so on. Then we raise the question, because our issue here is nature, finance, and food systems, can the financial system respond positively in order to provide positive nature climate outcomes that are also equitable? And our global model, designed by our friends at Vivid Economics, presented by Jason Ives, the executive director, prove that the answer is yes. We can get net zero, no biodiversity loss, with gains on jobs, with a lower cost, and with food affordability. Then we said, okay, but is that true if we go down a real economy? And then we picked Brazil as an example, and then with the work that Alex Kuberle from Imperial College and Angela Burgel from FGV Agro and Isabel Karin, we came to the framing that yes, it is possible. And the second question, which was which policies need to be applied to this, were also designed. Then there was an exercise of extracting from those specific designs for Brazil to what would be a general framework that we could share with other countries in the world. And if we were to prototype this in different jurisdictions, we could get those results. And they're based on low carbon, efficiency, consumers, just transition, command and control, and more importantly, as you said, Isabel, governance issues. Finally, we spoke about the role of consumers, which is normally not taken into the equation as a key player. And I would say there are two key players on this. One is society at large when they're making their policy choices, and that's why we aimed for the elections in Brazil. But the other one is society when it's using its attribution as consumers and making choices of what they are buying, trading, eating, and so on. So food systems will not change only with different approaches from the financial sector investors, but one can say that food systems will also not change unless the financial system and the investors respond to these challenges. So very happy now to put a few questions for our panel. And you may notice that we have Alexandra Dumitru here from Vivid Economics. And for many people that don't know, Lex was actually the coordinator for the study of Vivid Economics. And so she is deeply engaged and involved in all the framing of the work that came out of it. And I think I'll start with you, Alex, with actually two questions for you. One question is, when we started this exercise and we only had questions and no answers, one of the concerns we had was there may be a negative trade-off there where in order to address the climate nature risks and crisis, we may have a price to pay in terms of jobs. And that's always a difficult trade-off for any country. Yet we got quite a surprising result. So I would like to ask you if you would like to comment a little bit on maybe not only the jobs result, but also the access to nutrition one. That would be very nice. But because you come from the financial sector, I have to ask you a second question, which is, okay, so we demonstrated with this incredible global model that we can do it and there are opportunities. We went to a jurisdiction in Brazil. Alex's model basically framed and proved that similar results were obtained at the local level, at the jurisdictional level. We even were able to select 6 policies that will make a difference. So if I am the financial sector, I would say, yes, that's what we need to do. We will work with policies aligned to our investment strategies, and we'll solve the climate nature crisis. But we know that that world is not so easy. So if you could tell us a little bit of, in your mind, what is needed now to move all this wealth of knowledge towards real impact, to shift the way financial sector and investors are looking into food systems. So question one is jobs and access to nutrition on the model itself. And the second is more based on your experience as someone from the financial sector. How do you think we should move this forward to get the results we want? Welcome.
Thank you, Marcelo, and thank you also for the great questions. So let me start first on the economic impact and how come that we can get to net zero and even see nature restoration while actually stabilizing economic growth, on having it not at the cost of economic growth or jobs. So I think that to understand the impact better, we have to look a bit deeper into our report, because we created two scenarios for a reason, right? We also compared this financial risk-driven scenario with one that is driven by policy that is anticipated and planned in a gradual way. And there we see stark differences between the two scenarios, right? So while in one scenario, jobs are stabilized or maybe even falling a bit, like in the financial risk-driven one at the global level, in the policy facilitated scenario, the outcomes are much better. I can say that GDP, for example, is 17% higher in a policy-driven scenario in 2050. Jobs also about 9%. So there are quite differences. So I guess the conclusion there is that, yes, with a financial risk-driven scenario whereby the financial sector suddenly prices in climate risk, we can get to net zero, but it's not the optimal way, because we can also do it with even better economic outcomes. And also, if we look at affordability and nutrition, we also see there in our report, you can find some analysis on how the change in food prices as a result of this transition affect food affordability. And we also see that looks much better in a policy facilitated scenario. So more people, about 3.3 million more, have access to an affordable diet. So I would like to pause there. And before I pause on this, if we look at Brazil, because we also did a bit of a case study on Brazil with a similar modeling, which is a global modeling, just looking at specific case, there we see that the results are even starker between the two scenarios. And what we see is that because Brazil has a comparative advantage in both livestock as well as the nature-based solutions, particularly afforestation activities, that there both jobs and GDP almost double in a policy facilitated scenario, where we do see again room for improvements in productivity and sustainability of the sector, as well as nature positive solutions such as afforestation. And that makes a huge difference for the economic outcomes, namely economic growth of the sector, of the food sector, and employment. So in particular cases, the differences can be even bigger. So I will pause here to see if there are any questions or any comments from your side before moving to the role of the financial sector.
No, please go ahead with the financial sector.
Right. So as we concluded, as we introduced also in our report the scenarios, we highlight that such an abrupt price correction for climate and nature by the financial sector is not unthinkable in a world in which policy is not going fast enough to get us to net zero. Hence, climate and nature risks are just accumulating. And in a world in which there's more and more pressure on the financial sector to assess how to decarbonize the portfolio and the risks that any carbon or emissions in their portfolio brings with it. So I think that that is slowly already happening. And I think that what we're doing here and this kind of information is what is needed for the financial sector. So in general, the financial sector, when something becomes more material, and I think with climate change and nature slowly materializing, we see more events that highlight the impact that these events could have. And with more data, making it more possible for the sector to quantify, then it's easier to take these kind of assessments into decision making. I think that in the past, climate change was a bit maybe more abstract, and I think this kind of work is particularly important to highlight the differences between the various scenarios and why the sector is in the sector's best interest to act, as also for the financial sector, a gradual transition leads to better outcomes.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Alex, a question for you, because you raised something in your presentation that the results of the modeling indicated that is not so intuitive, which is the fact that food producing countries should look into alternative protein challenges and opportunities as well. Given the world we are in and the possibility of us overshooting 1.5 degrees, and now food becoming a national security issue, many countries, even the ones that don't have nature, land, are looking at how can they produce food. So suddenly, the alternative protein space is going to get much more crowded. And I imagine that the financial sector would look at this with new eyes, which means that there may be investments to be made and opportunities for countries like Brazil to undertake it. You mentioned the industrial policies need, you mentioned the agricultural policies need. What else do you think are challenges for countries in the majority nature-rich countries are not rich countries? What are the challenges you think countries that today rely a lot on nature need to think about when they think about food production from another angle?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I think I will answer that in a way that I would answer any questions about investing in countries that are not industrial countries by nature. So usually the countries that are nature rich tend to be emerging economies, developing countries in the tropics, and they suffer from more or less common challenges. And they can be summarized in terms of country risk, which the financial sector already prices in terms of cost of capital and so on, the premium that they charge for investing and for opening credit in some of these regions. So there's a governance issue. I think a big part of the country risk, and speaking of Brazil itself, a good example is just the inefficiency of its judicial system. Contracts need to be enforceable. Land rights need to be very clearly defined. And this is not just about land ownership and title to land, but also the rights of local and indigenous communities that have an intrinsic right to the land that they've occupied since historical times. So these things need to be very clear so that it doesn't generate a new source of risk. So land tenure, judicial security, efficient courts, governance laws that are not contradicting each other, that don't create problems like that. So that's one side, that's the governance side. The other side is also infrastructure and education, skilled labor force, because alternative proteins are they're more of an industrial sector. They're not, there is an agricultural component, which is the inputs that go into that, but then there's a whole industrial process transformation that needs to be in place in order to transform sugars into, or other plant-based material into protein that can be consumed by humans. So it needs to be at a high standard and so on. So there's an industrial aspect to this. So developing that industrial base, the infrastructure, and the skilled labor force, I think is some of the challenges that will have to be addressed.
Great, thank you. And interesting enough, the enabling environment and education within the enabling environment, Sarah, is one of the outcomes that came out of your research regarding how to move consumers. I understand that the study Every Action Count did with all its partners was nudging online behavior I think that's a very smart way to go, because not only it's an increasing part of how people are accessing food in different countries, but also it's an easier way for us to measure. There may be a criticism from people saying that if you go in the online world, you're excluding a lot of people from this conversation. And the second question is, when you're nudging people online, you are disconnecting people from those issues that we are trying to address. When the test was done, I understand that we were able to actually deep dive into all economic sectors and address most of the concerns of what people think about health, sustainability, and so on. Would you like to comment a little bit more about the opportunities of the online, offline study that you've done?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Marcelo, for the question. Definitely using the online as a controlled environment allowed us to test and to give those messages, ensuring that the consumers had received the necessary information for them to understand the certain labels that were tested with them. For example, this is the key part also on using labeling, is ensuring that the consumers are actually understanding that. And so on an online environment, you really have the opportunity of link the labels with the education, which is a little bit more difficult on the normal or more traditional retail store. So that's the first part. But then the recommendations to use labeling is really to empower the consumers. And there are two reasons for that. The first is that when the whole complexity of the impact of a certain food has been already kind of digested for the consumers, and that what they see is only an A, B, C, D, E, let's say, as a result, they don't actually have to take that burden themselves of understanding a whole and complex food system. And this is something that came out really strongly on the research also we did in the dialogues we had with consumers, is that they expect that level of support from governments, from policymakers, but also from the retail sector to help them make the right choices. So that's the first part of the empowerment, is enabling them to take decisions without having to know all of those nitty-gritty details that require expertise to understand. But the second one is more of an indirect empowerment, and that is that once you start having transparency around the impact of food products, etc., it is out there, it's in the public domain, if you wish. And you start having more competition between retailers, between brand owners, etc., on trying to do better so that they can reduce the impact, because they know that then this is shown transparently. And so the consumer does not even have to really do anything in that space, and just let the market do its work. And that's the second empowerment to the consumers. It is thanks to them because it is designed for them, but it does not put the burden on themselves. And so this is an angle that is pretty interesting to integrate. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. And let me put the final question as we're reaching our deadline here. There is an elephant in the room in the whole discussion of food systems transition, which is the just transition. And I think the financial sector will play and can play a critical role on that. It is not only about being nature and climate positive, it is also about being equitable. And I understand both Karen and Isabel, that when you were doing the work, not only of selecting the 6 public policies for Brazil, but even now when you made the cluster of what are the cluster that we could share with any other country, any other jurisdiction, that will be true for Brazil, for Southeast Asia, for Africa, for Europe, for the US, for anyone. So could you elaborate a little bit more? Let me start with you, Karen, on what are the key indicators one would like to share from our studies on just transition on food systems?
Hi, hello, everybody. I hope you hear me well. The studies, they showed that the just transition, it should touch in two sides, the demand side and the supply side. And if we look to the policies that are there, that are suggested on the demand side for the just transition, programs as social inclusion programs like money transfer for families, support for school and food systems at school level for kids, those are all programs that can help to move the transition more smoothly for the people that are more vulnerable. On the demand side, programs that provide education, as Alexandre has said over here, for the farmers, programs that can connect, such as the program of acquisition of food that is being implemented by the Brazilian government, is being awarded by the FAO. Those are the type of things that are policies that government can coordinate among the support for creation of cooperatives between the farmers, supporting for creating systems of selling and in a package, right, together. And those are not reinventing necessarily the wheel, because there is examples over there, there's examples outside on the international fora. What we do is also the political will to make it. What it's being shown nowadays is, depending on the systems, those policies are quickly left behind.
Right.
So this must be on the center of the conversation.
Fantastic.
And I just want to call your attention later on that Simon Zadek has asked the question about deforestation that maybe Alexandre can address, and Isabel.
Okay, so for the sake of time, Isabel, would you agree to address the question? Because as an expert on deforestation, I think that it would be great that Simon gets. Simon, by the way, is the executive director of Nature Finance. And it's actually the guy that had the idea of putting this research project together. Because we had those questions and we saw the debate on the food system world, but people not really the hard questions, seeking the maybe difficult answers. Turns out the answers were good, but we didn't know that when we did the questions. So Isabel, Simon is asking if you would cover a little bit the potential of extra-jurisdictional oversight, such as anti-money laundering or the EU due diligence legislation that is coming up, as strategies to help halt deforestation in forest-rich countries.
Sure. Yes. Brazil has now an opportunity to really address deforestation in the. I will talk more about the supply chain because we work a lot of this. So to respond to the due diligence or to European legislation, or also to the US legislation coming soon, all the industry in the beef sector and the soy sector, but of course some of other agricultural sectors, has to monitor and verify their supply chains. And in the beef sector is the most challenged sector. But there is a way to do that. And I think that finance, there is a hole in this, because we can see already initiatives from the beef industry, for instance, working with offices in the territories. So you can articulate subnational strategies, the programs, the subnational plans, the programs to monitor and to uniform, to harmonize all this monitoring, to do this with less costs. So it's jurisdictional, it's joint efforts to do that, not to do each industry their own monitoring system. So this is a huge agenda, and I think that somehow finance sector has a role in that. Another role to solve this problem of the deforestation in the indirect supply is the most challenging part of the supply chain, is the policies and the actions to reinsert the producers that are not regular with the environmental laws, but they are not criminals. Criminals are criminals. But we have a lot of medium and small holders that are not regular, but they can turn to regular one producers. So we can, in a jurisdictional or a territorial approach, to join efforts from private sector, governments, and system law to solve this. It's a good position of Brazil. We have some jurisdictional programs in place. We have to put forward and to learn of the lessons and to apply the solutions.
Thank you. And Alex, I think because you work on this field, modeling these situations so much, you may have a view on the importance of non-supply chain oriented actions. For example, the anti-money laundering legislation, which I think it's quite interesting because it looks at the other end of the corner, which is eventually investment companies and banks that are putting money into it and maybe claiming that they don't know, or indeed they don't know. But the fact of the matter is that we are in a world where you can't claim ignorance anymore because there's so much data there, right?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in money laundering. I'm not going to pretend to be, but yes, there is a lot of data. I don't know to what extent can you completely 100% clean up your investment portfolio off of that without any uncertainty, but the effort needs to be there. A framework needs to exist. And if we use the example of Brazil, there's a lot of illegal deforestation. There's a lot of illegal mining activity. The organized crime controls places where the state is not present. So if the state is absent, other groups will move in, and they are involved in money laundering activities. And for example, Isabel mentioned agriculture, but also illegal logging that ends up in corner offices around the world. I mean, this is also something that is also very important to bring up. Is that where? So it's important to have frameworks in regions like the EU and the US, but it's not enough to just put up a barrier. I think they also need to provide avenues for solutions, because otherwise it's not going to move the needle very far. I think it's one thing to say we're not going to purchase things that are illegal, that have any tainted materials in it, but here is a way that you can come in through the front door, right? So to provide a possible solution that would bring people on board and to take advantage of all the legal and the growing international frameworks and carbon markets and Article 6, for example, jurisdictional red and so on, that enable illegal activities to be well rewarded.
Thank you so much. So let me apologize, Catherine, for not bringing your question up because we're already exploding in our time allocation here. But to ensure you that we will answer your question offline, particularly because you're asking a question on carbon markets, and Nature Finances has a whole task force on nature markets that is looking the carbon plus world. So we'll be super happy to do that. And Alex, when we launched Nature Finance in Geneva earlier this month, we brought to our launch ceremony Neidinha Surui speaking on behalf of the indigenous communities that are suffering with illegal gold mining. And we brought Raul Jungmann, the president of the Brazilian Mining Association. And what was very interesting from this conversation is that here you have the mining industry and the indigenous peoples both wanting to stop illegal gold mining, have traceability, have financial systems with working with the central bank, with tax authorities and so on, but also to ensure that there is investment on standing forests, the bioeconomy, so you can offer what Isabel was saying, which is jobs and incomes and social alternatives for the people that live in the forest. So I'm very happy to see that we're ending our wonderful webinar with what was actually the beginning of Nature Finance. I encourage you all that are participating with us to visit our website. I'd like to thank very much our panelists and your organizations to being with us. And hopefully we'll be able to continue this work further and having more advanced conversations coming up in the near future. So for now, thank you so much for being here. And just to let our audience know that all these contents are available in English and Portuguese. And whatever result happens in Brazil with the elections on October 30th, we at Nature Finance are looking forward to presenting again these 6 recommendations to the new Brazilian government in order to make a difference and halt the climate crisis, help the nature loss, and address the equity challenges we have in Brazil and in the world. Thank you so much for being here today. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.